Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy 1010, the summer session for 2019. In this video, we are going over Hegel and comparing him to the Daoist philosophy of Zhuangzi. So the question is, for exam 3, part A, number 4, how is Hegel's philosophy similar to Zhuangzi's Daoist philosophy in chapter 13 of our book? All right, so Hegel follows Kant, and Kant followed David Hume. So Hume said we can't have knowledge, we can't have absolutely certain, necessary, universally true knowledge of the so-called physical world. That at best we can have probable knowledge. There are no laws of physics that are necessarily true everywhere in the universe, because he's an empiricist. He says knowledge comes from your sense organs, and I can't perceive any necessary laws of cause and effect. Those are relations of ideas in your mind. They're not matters of fact in the world that you perceive. He doesn't even believe in actual enduring unified material objects like George Berkeley before him. He says all we experience are sense perceptions, and then we have a propensity to create the fiction of enduring objects, just like we have a propensity to believe we are a unified, enduring self that stays the same from one moment to the next. Kant said, okay, I see your point, and yet Isaac Newton did discover these laws of physics that do seem to be necessarily true everywhere in the universe. The laws of mathematics do seem to be universal truths. And so what he said is, we can have absolute certain knowledge of the way the world appears to us. The objects that we perceive, we can know exactly how they'll interact with each other in nature, because what we're perceiving is only our perceptions. The appearances of the natural world in our mind follow the laws of our own thinking, the categories of thought, a priori categories of thought. But, says Kant, we cannot know the thing in itself. Whatever an object is outside of our perception of it is impossible for us to know, because how would we know what it is if we don't perceive it? And if we perceive it, we're automatically categorizing the information according to these a priori categories of thought, like space, time, and cause and effect. We don't see or touch or smell or hear space or time, and yet every object we perceive is presented in a context of space and time, and it's interrelated through a chain of causes and effects. None of those are empirically observable. Kant says, no, they're not, but we can know they're real through what he called transcendental apperception. Okay, so that was the previous video. Hegel says we can have knowledge of the thing in itself because there is no separation between our knowledge and the thing in itself. If it's knowledge, which means it's true, then it has to be absolutely true. And if it's absolutely true, it must be one with the absolute. All right, so I'm just going to say that is similar to the Daoist philosophy that is saying you can gain knowledge through the becoming a subjective unity with the objective, putting yourself in a subjective relation with all things. That's what Zhuangzi's ultimate recommendation is. Don't see yourself as outside the world and observing it. Put yourself inside everything. See the world from the perspective of everything that you think is outside of you. That's having this obliterating unity of the Tao that can give you absolute knowledge. So, Zhuangzi's a skeptic, and at the same time he believes there is absolute knowledge to be had, because you can become one with the Tao. So that kind of it's similar to Hegel. It's not exactly identical, but first let me go over Hegel and then we'll compare that to Zhuangzi. So if you look at the introductory notes, Hegel's Historicism, page 485. So the introductory notes say his distinctively dynamic form of idealism set the stage for other 19th century Western philosophers. All right, so dynamic means movement, change. That's what he's interested in. The laws of history, how things unfold through history, reveals absolute knowledge. It's not the individual realizations of science, but the progress of science. Each stage in the evolution of science, taken together, reveals the object of knowledge that it's perceiving. So, but the difference between subject and object disintegrates along the way. That's what we see in the Daoist philosophy also. So Hegel rejects that we can't know the thing in itself because he says we are the thing in itself, and the thing in itself is us. So it's all right. So on page 486, at the top is the introductory notes say, this is not to say that philosophy cannot express any universal or necessary truths, but they are not the kinds of truths sought by Kant or other previous rationalists. What stays constant across historical circumstances are not a priori propositions or innate concepts, but the set of dynamic principles governing the development of our ways of constructing the world. All right, so the evolution of our understanding of the world follows a very definite pattern of stages. That's what's, for Hegel, the unchanging absolute truths, these categories of thought that Kant talked about, space, time, and causality. For Hegel, the way we perceive space, time, and causality can change, but each phase of the way it changes doesn't change. There's a set series of steps, and that is what is the structuring principle to be understood. So continuing in the introductory notes, second, then Hegel finds some universal and necessary truths, but they are high-level dynamic principles governing the development of thought, the best known as the thesis, antithesis, synthesis pattern. So in our introduction, in our excerpt from Hegel's Phenomenology of Mind, he doesn't get into the whole thesis, antithesis, synthesis dialectical pattern. But in a nutshell, what Hegel says is, here's the process of nature. Here's the unchanging pattern of development. As applied to human thought, someone puts forward a theory, a thesis. Then someone else says, oh, look what you forgot to mention. The exact opposite of what you say is true. That's called the antithesis, the antithesis. And then someone else says, oh, if you put those two together, you have a more complete truth. And that's called a synthesis. But then the synthesis is seen as a new thesis. Someone else says, look, there's an antithesis. And then someone synthesizes them. And so it's this zigzagging pattern, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, which becomes a new thesis, antithesis, synthesis, like that. And it's heading, however, according to Hegel, toward a definite point in history where absolute knowledge will be had. And similarly, for Zhuangzi, you can achieve this unity with the Tao and become one with the universe and have all knowledge. So Zhuangzi's a skeptic, but he's only skeptical about a certain way of having knowledge. If you're trying to compare things, not realizing that you are one with them, then you'll never get knowledge of them. That's his skepticism of that kind of pursuit of knowledge, but he's not skeptical about the ability to know the thing in itself, because he's assuming we are one with the thing in itself, which he calls the Tao. All right, so that's a basic overview. Now let me get into some of the actual text from Hegel's Phenomenology of Mind. So in the left-hand column of page 487, so he's talking here about what Kant said before him and Hume about they're afraid that we'll never have knowledge of the thing in itself, and or Hume, he's just total skeptic. We can't have knowledge; it's impossible to have. So we can't have certain knowledge of necessary universal truths about the objective world, says Hume, and Kant says the same thing, although we can have knowledge of the appearances. So here is what Hegel says. He goes, this apprehensiveness is sure to pass even into the conviction that the whole enterprise, which sets out to secure for consciousness by means of knowledge what exists per se, is in its very nature absurd. So I want to know what exists. I want to know what existence is. And Hegel's saying, if you look at the world like people like Hume and Kant, then you'll think that it's an absurd attempt. He goes, and that between knowledge and the absolute there lies a boundary. This is not what Hegel believes. He's putting forth what others, like Kant, believe. So, and that between knowledge and the absolute there lies a boundary which completely cuts off the one from the other. For if knowledge is the instrument by which to get possession of absolute reality, the suggestion immediately occurs that the application of an instrument to anything does not leave it as it is for itself, but rather entails in the process and has in view a molding and alteration of it. That's Kant. You can't know the thing in itself because once you perceive it, it's digested, it's broken down and reorganized according to the categories of thought, space, time, and causality. So you can't know it. And this is what Hegel's explaining some people's opinions are. He says, or again, if knowledge is not an instrument which we actively employ, but a kind of passive medium through which the light of the truth reaches us, then here too we do not receive it as it is in itself, but as it is through and in this medium. In either case, we employ a means which immediately brings about the very opposite of its own end, or rather, the absurdity lies in making use of any means at all. So if you use means to gain absolute knowledge, the very attempt is absurd, because you're putting a boundary between you and the absolute knowledge, thereby making it impossible to have absolute knowledge. But what Hegel says is the absurdity lies in making use of any means at all. So he's saying that we're not different from knowledge. We can know the thing in itself. We are the thing in itself. So if you go to page 488, paragraph 76 on the left-hand column. So he's numbered these paragraphs. So he says, with such like useless ideas and expressions about knowledge as an instrument to take hold of the absolute, or as a medium through which we have a glimpse of truth, and so on, relations to which all these ideas of a knowledge which is divided from the absolute, and an absolute divided from knowledge in the last resort lead, we need not concern ourselves. All right, we don't have to worry about theories that say there's a barrier between us and knowledge of the absolute. Nor need we trouble about the evasive pretexts which create the incapacity of science out of the presupposition of such relations in order at once to be rid of the toil of science and to assume the air of serious and zealous effort about it. That's Hume. Hume says science can't give us knowledge, necessary universal knowledge, so why waste our time trying? Just realize you can't have it. So Hegel is dismissing Hume and Kant as trying to, the one's kind of a quitter, he's a zealous quitter so that he can have a serious air of dismissing science instead of engaging in the hard work of developing an actual science that can lead to knowledge of the absolute. Knowledge of the absolute is realizing we are part and parcel with the absolute. So on the right-hand column, he says, but science, all right, so in response to people like Hume, who says science can't give us universal absolute truth, he says, with better right, on the contrary, we might spare ourselves the trouble of taking any notice at all of such ideas and ways of talking, which would have the effect of warding off science altogether, for they make a mere empty show of knowledge, which at once vanishes when science comes on the scene. So compare David Hume's skepticism about science to Isaac Newton, and Hegel says, the one gives us actual knowledge, it works. The other is filled with skepticism, and its importance vanishes in light of the technological wonders that science actually provides. But you'd be quick to note the science that we have at that time, this is the 18th century, isn't the final truth. So continuing, he says, but science, in the very fact that it comes on the scene, is itself a phenomenon, meaning an appearance. It's not the noumena, it's not the thing in itself yet, because the thing in itself entails all of its levels of development. And the science coming on the scene at a certain point in history is necessarily partial. It has to be seen in relation to its whole developmental trajectory. That's Hegel's historicist form of rationalism, that you have to see, you have to learn about the absolute by seeing how it shapes historical progress. All right, so, but science, in the very fact that it comes on the scene, is itself a phenomenon. Its coming on the scene is not yet itself carried out in all the length and breadth of its truth. In this regard, it is a matter of indifference whether we consider that it, science, is a phenomenon because it makes its appearance alongside another kind of knowledge, which is like, for example, metaphysics of Plato and the skepticism of Hume, and then Kant's. So all those, there's science, and then there's that other stuff, that science appears on the scene alongside other forms of undeveloped knowledge, or whether he's going to go on to say it's the outcome of those previous stages of knowledge. It doesn't make a difference. It's still a partial phase. So let me read this again. In this regard, it is a matter of indifference whether we consider that it, science, is a phenomenon because it makes its appearance alongside another kind of knowledge, or call that other untrue knowledge its process of appearing. Science, however, must liberate itself from this phenomenality, and it can only do so by turning against itself. So here's his, we can see the idea of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. So there's science. It shows us, oh, look, knowledge of the objective world, for example, Isaac Newton. But because that's just, it appeared in history at one point, so it's not the whole sequence of historical events, it's going to necessarily turn against itself. But that will then lead to a synthesis. So, and then after I go through a few more paragraphs, then I'm going to start comparing it to Zhuangzi. All right, so it can only do so by turning against itself. Moving over to page 489, paragraph 77, he says, now, because this exposition, this is his writing, he's investigating knowledge as a phenomenon. All right, for this reason, we shall here undertake the exposition of knowledge as a phenomenon. Phenomenon means something that appears on the historical scene at a certain point. And he goes, now, because this exposition has for its object only phenomenal knowledge, the exposition itself seems not to be science, free, self-moving in the shape proper to itself, but may, from this point of view, be taken as the pathway of the natural consciousness which is pressing forward to true knowledge. So his study right now, he's saying, I'm not revealing to you the final shape of all science, but I'm trying to show you the pathway of consciousness as it appears naturally in history, pressing forward to true knowledge. There is a point in history where true knowledge will be had. But what he's analyzing right now isn't that yet. He says, or it can be regarded as the path of the soul, which is traversing the series of its own forms of embodiment, like stages appointed for it by its own nature, that it may possess the clearness of spiritual life when, through the complete experience of its own self, it arrives at the knowledge of what it is in itself. So to have a complete experience of its own self, you have to have knowledge of the entire historical pattern of development. So, continuing here on paragraph 780, he says, natural consciousness will prove itself to be only knowledge in principle or not real knowledge. Since, however, it immediately takes itself to be the real and genuine knowledge, this pathway has a negative significance for it. What is the realization of the notion of knowledge means for it rather the ruin and overthrow of itself. All right, so he's talking about how science then contradicts itself. It thinks it has genuine knowledge because it has knowledge of the objective physical world. And it's seeing, I have knowledge of a thing outside myself. And that is not absolute knowledge. That's relative knowledge. You're looking at something outside yourself, necessarily from your own outside perspective, and you can't know the thing in itself that way. You have to become one with the thing. That's what he's going to be leading up to. This is what Zhuangzi also says. So he's saying, since, however, it immediately takes itself to be the real and genuine knowledge, this pathway has a negative significance for it. What is a realization of the notion of knowledge means for it rather the ruin and overthrow of itself, for on this road it loses its own truth. Because of that, the road can be looked on as the path of doubt, or more properly, a highway of despair. So Hume was the despairing one. And even Kant was kind of despairing of ever knowing the thing in itself. That's what science. Isaac Newton's on the scene. We know everything. We have knowledge of the universe. We understand the ideas God had in mind when God created the universe. No, we don't, says Hume and Kant. Although Kant did give us some hope of at least having science and absolute certainty of the world of appearances. So now Hegel is going to say, all right, but that's just another level. The final truth would be realizing that there is no ultimate separation between the world as it appears to us and the thing in itself. That's absolute knowledge. And that is very similar to Taoism. So continuing here, paragraph 79 on page 49, the series of shapes which consciousness traverses on this road is rather the detailed history of the process of training and educating consciousness itself up to the level of science. All right, so the series of shapes which consciousness traverses on this road is rather the detailed history of the process of training and educating consciousness itself up to the level of science. Science, properly understood, understands all of these phases along the way of its own development. That resolve presents this mental development in the simple form of an intended purpose as immediately furnished and complete as having taken place. This pathway, on the other hand, is, as opposed to this abstract intention or untruth, the actual carrying out of the process of development to follow one's own conviction. All right, so skipping down a little bit more on page 49. Skepticism directed to the whole compass of phenomenal consciousness, on the contrary, makes mind for the first time qualified to test what truth is, since it brings about a despair regarding what are called natural views, thoughts, and opinions. So skepticism is a required phase along the path leading to absolute science, because he says it makes mind for the first time qualified to test what truth is. And that was Hume. So Kant said Hume awoke him from his dogmatic slumber. So the skepticism of Hume made Kant stop and say, wait a minute, he's got a good point. And it prompts the next phase of knowledge. So for Zhuangzi, he was a skeptic about gaining knowledge through the world and all of the different people with their different perspectives. And his whole point was unite the opposites, put yourself in subjective relation with everything, with externals, and that way you can have absolute knowledge of the Tao, universal knowledge. So we'll get to that as soon as we finish going through Hegel. So continuing on page 49, he says, the completeness of the forms of unreal consciousness will be brought about precisely through the necessity of the advance and the necessity of their connection with one another. So unreal consciousness is the partial, historically isolated phases along the way. Their connection is a necessary reality that when you can see the whole chain of progress, that is real consciousness. I think it's important also at this point to point out that Isaac Newton was superseded by Einstein. And Einstein's theory of special relativity, and then which was broadened into general relativity, but both of them say the past, the present, and the future coexist. And to have knowledge of each of these phases of history for Hegel, that's absolute knowledge. Well, how can we have knowledge of each of these phases of history? They come and they go and they're gone. They don't exist anymore. Hegel didn't believe that, and neither did Einstein. So, and there's a lot of similarities between Hegel's philosophy and Einstein's. The way Einstein responded to Newton is similar to the way Hegel's philosophy kind of responds to the philosophies that were sparked by Newton's theory of gravity. So just the point is, what are you talking about? Absolute knowledge entails knowing the whole historical progression. Well, Einstein showed that whole historical progression of the entire universe does coexist. The past, present, and future, they all coexist. What's the past for you would be considered the future for someone else moving in a different direction at a different speed. So it's called the relativity of simultaneity. What's happening, two things happening now to you from someone else's perspective, one could be happening first and then the other, and from someone else's perspective moving in another direction at a different speed, it gets reversed. The ultimate result is all points of space-time coexist. And that is important for Hegel's philosophy. So I'll read that again and then continue. The completeness of the forms of unreal consciousness will be brought about precisely through the necessity of the advance and the necessity of their connection with one another. To say that they're necessarily connected in a certain way is as much as to say it's determined. Well, that's what Einstein was. He was a determinist. Yes, things are connected in a certain way. You can see them, you can perceive them differently depending on your point of view, but all events coexist. So now I'm getting out of my own league here to a degree, but just keep in mind what he's saying isn't unscientific. He's saying this is the future of science. Well, it really was the future of science to a degree of what he's trying to talk about here. So to make this comprehensible, we may remark by way of preliminary that the exposition of untrue consciousness in its untruth is not a merely negative process. Such a one-sided view of it is what the natural consciousness generally adopts. So it's not only negative that each phase is partial and therefore not absolutely true, because that idea is itself the one-sided point of view that is untrue. He says, and a knowledge which makes this one-sidedness its essence is one of those shapes assumed by incomplete consciousness, which falls into the course of the inquiry itself and will come before us there. For this view is skepticism, which always sees in the result only pure nothingness. All right. So again, skepticism is just one phase, a necessary phase along the path toward realizing the whole sequence of the evolutionary phases of knowledge, and that's absolute truth. So, page 490, paragraph 80, he says, the goal, however, is fixed for knowledge, just as necessarily as the succession in the process. The terminus is at that point where knowledge is no longer compelled to go beyond itself, where it finds its own self, and the notion corresponds to the object, and the object to the notion. If you go over on page 491, paragraph 84, he says, but the nature of the object which we are examining surmounts this separation, or semblance of separation, and presupposition. Consciousness furnishes its own criterion in itself, and the inquiry will thereby be a comparison of itself with its own self, for the distinction just made falls inside itself. Continuing to the other side of the page, he says, thus, in what consciousness inside itself declares to be the essence or truth, we have the standard which itself sets up and by which we are to measure its knowledge. All right, so he concludes by saying, consequently, we do not require to bring standards with us, so standards by which to measure the objective world, nor to apply our fancies and thoughts in the inquiry, and just by our leaving these aside, we are enabled to treat and discuss the subject as it actually is in itself and for itself, as it is in its complete reality. All right, so that is the end of the Hegel reading. I'm sure that didn't make complete sense to you because it didn't make complete sense to me, but I have a pretty good idea of what Hegel's saying. He's not quite as complicated of a writer, at least in this excerpt, as Kant was, in my opinion, but I think comparing it to Zhuangzi's Daoist philosophy will help make both of them a little more understandable. So how is Hegel's philosophy similar? I'll just read this. How is Hegel's philosophy similar to Zhuangzi's Daoist philosophy in chapter 13 of our book? So I got to make sure not to turn this camera off. All right, now going back to page, let's see here, page 324. So this is from Zhuangzi. He begins on page 323. Great knowledge embraces the whole, small knowledge a part only. Great speech is universal, small speech is particular. In a way that's similar to Hegel, who says absolute knowledge comprehends the entire sequence of historical development of thought itself. That's great knowledge. It embraces the whole. Small knowledge is each of the phases along the way, each one tending to contradict the one before it. So you have the thesis, antithesis, synthesis, but that synthesis is then contradicted, in, as I've said before. All right, so continuing now on page 324, he says, I'm going to skip to the right-hand column about halfway down. He says, Tao is obscured by our want of grasp. So the Tao, Taoism is based on the concept of the Tao. That's the one. That's everything. It contains everything. It orders everything. It gives structure to everything that has structure. And it is the process of reconciling opposites, which is very similar to Hegel's idea of the thesis, antithesis, synthesis. For the Tao, everything is a combination, a union of the opposites of yin and yang. Yin is feminine, yang is masculine. Yin is dark, yang is light. All the pairs of opposites are contained in the yin and the yang, but each contains the seed of the other, as you can see in the yin-yang symbol. So I'll read here, continuing here. Tao is obscured by our want of grasp. Speech is obscured by the gloss of this world. Hence, the affirmatives and negatives of the Confucian and Maoist schools, each denying what the other affirmed and affirming what the other denied. But he who would reconcile affirmative with negative and negative with affirmative must do so by the light of nature. So again, that's similar to Hegel's idea of reconciling the opposites to lead you towards absolute knowledge. Then, continuing, Zhuangzi says, there is nothing which is not objective. There is nothing which is not subjective. But it is impossible to start from the objective. Only from subjective knowledge is it possible to proceed to objective knowledge. So that is, we saw also Hegel say things very similar to that. Those who think knowledge is a medium or an instrument to gain knowledge of something outside of ourselves put up a barrier between us and absolute knowledge. But if we are that absolute knowledge, then we can actually know it. We can know ourselves immediately. We can't know something outside of ourselves because it's mediated to us and thereby altered by that mediating process. Hegel says, ultimately, there is no mediating process required when you realize you're one with the absolute idea. Similar to Plato's idea of the good. It's the ultimate knowledge to be had. Open the eye of the soul to the idea of the good and realize how all of the eternal forms are imprinted on your soul and you're one with everything. You can have knowledge of everything because you're one with everything. All right, so the bottom of page 324 in the right-hand column. He goes, which being the case, the true sage rejects all distinctions of this and that. He takes his refuge in Tao and places himself in subjective relation with all things. Similar to what Hegel was saying, as we saw when we went through that Hegel reading. So continuing here, page 325 on the left, when subjective and objective are both without their correlates, that is the very axis of Tao. And when that axis passes through the center at which all infinities converge, positive and negative alike, blend into an infinite one. Hence it has been said that there is nothing like the light of nature. And we saw Hegel say that. Don't think that there's a barrier between us and universal knowledge. We're one with the universe to be understood. And although it's not in the selection that we're reading in this book from Hegel, the imagery of the light of nature and the infinite one in which all infinities converge is very similar to Hegel's concept of the absolute idea, the final goal of history. So on the bottom of the left-hand column, page 325, Zhuangzi says, only the truly intelligent understand this principle of the identity of all things. They do not view things as apprehended by themselves, subjectively, but transfer themselves into the position of the things viewed. In viewing them thus, they are able to comprehend them, nay, to master them, and he who can master them is near. So it is that to place oneself in subjective relation with externals, without consciousness of their objectivity, this is Tao. But to wear out one's intellect in an obstinate adherence to the individuality of things, not recognizing the fact that all things are one, this is called 3 in the morning. So then we went over that in the video about Zhuangzi. The monkeys get mad when the zookeeper says, I'll give you 3 acorns in the morning and 4 in the evening. They want 4 first and 3 later. The zookeeper says, all right, it's the same amount, but I'm putting myself in your shoes. It's no skin off my back. If that makes you happy, fine. So that is understanding others by putting yourself in their shoes, or in other words, on a deeper sense, realizing you and them are all rooted in the Tao. You share one supreme source. And therefore, it is possible for you to have knowledge of absolute, not relative knowledge. Relative knowledge meaning partial knowledge from your limited perspective. Absolute knowledge meaning complete and whole knowledge, which necessarily requires becoming one with the thing to be known. All right, so on page 326, at the bottom, so he's going through skepticism. So Zhuangzi is a skeptic about normal mundane knowledge giving you any kind of certainty about the way things work. How can you decide which standard to use? If you want to try to know what is beautiful, or, there's famously beautiful women to human males, but deer are afraid of those beautiful women. So are the fish and the birds. So they think they're fearsome and terrible. So who's right? Who's got the absolute standard of beauty in their mind? Is it the human species, the deer species? So he's going through different reasons, typical reasons for having skepticism. And Hegel will say that is one of the phases you need to go through in order to achieve that certainty that you can actually gain absolute knowledge. So after going through all this skeptical arguments about no one has the absolute standards of knowledge, Zhuangzi then goes on to say, at the very bottom of the right-hand column on page 326, the perfect man, answered Wang Yi, is a spiritual being. Were the ocean itself scorched up, he would not feel hot. Were the Milky Way frozen hard, he would not feel cold. Were the mountains to be riven with thunder and the great deep to be thrown up by a storm, he would not tremble. In such case, he would mount upon the clouds of heaven, and driving the sun and moon before him, would pass beyond the limits of this external world. Where death and life have no more victory over man, how much less what is bad for him? Okay, so the sage pays no heed to mundane affairs. He neither seeks gain nor avoids injury. And then later on he'll go and say, how does the sage seat himself by the sun and moon and hold the universe in his grasp? He blends everything into one harmonious whole, rejecting the confusion of this and that. Rank and precedence, which the vulgar prize, the sage stolidly ignores. The revolutions of 10,000 years leave his unity unscathed. The universe itself may pass away, but he will flourish still. So then he talks about there's a great awakening when you realize this whole world is a dream. On the bottom of the right-hand column on page 327, since then you and I and man cannot decide, must we not depend upon another? Such dependence is as though it were not dependence. We are embraced in the obliterating unity of Tao. There is perfect adaptation to whatever may eventuate, and so we complete our allotted span. But what is it to be embraced in the obliterating unity of Tao? It is this, with reference to positive and negative, to that which is so and that which is not so. All right, so I'm going to leave it there. He ends with the butterfly passage. I had a dream I was a butterfly, then I woke up. Now I don't know. Am I the butterfly dreaming I'm Zhuangzi, or am I Zhuangzi dreaming I was a butterfly. It's hard to tell. So he's the skeptic who nevertheless believes that there's this ability to achieve absolute knowledge through putting yourself in subjective relation with the external, which is the obliterating unity of Tao. Everything is rooted in Tao, which Hegel's calling the absolute. And although it seems that there are isolated parts of the absolute and that there's a boundary between us and knowledge of the absolute, in fact, there is no boundary, and we can gain absolute knowledge, which automatically is the goal of the historical progress of knowledge itself. So I'll leave it at that. I think I've given you enough material to create your own opinion, and the next video will be about Nietzsche.